Hey everybody, and welcome to another one of my UI challenge videos. If you haven't seen one of these videos before, basically all I do is take some concept that I want to build into an Ionic application, usually some kind of animation or just a cool looking component. I try to build that live on screen without planning how to do it beforehand, so all of the mistakes and learning is included along the way. So the goal here is just to get a general sort of prototype of the functionality. Sometimes it'll end up being pretty complete and polished. Sometimes we'll just get the basic concept, and in some cases I'll sort of finish things up in a blog post a bit more neatly afterwards. So in this video, what I'm going to try and do is create a sort of slide draw component using the new Ionic gestures that are in Ionic 5, or rather the exposure of the existing gesture system that Ionic has been using for their components. So I'll be using Angular to build this one, no particular reason why. I just figured I'd use Angular this time. Could also do it just with Stencil.js and with React or whatever you want to use. A lot of this stuff should be adaptable to whatever you are using. There's just going to be some things you would need to change out where I'm using something Angular specific. And so the basic idea behind what the component should do when we're done is I have this sort of just blank component generated now, but I want a section down the bottom of the screen and that I can swipe up with a gesture, and it will sort of follow along with the swipe and then reveal some content that's going to come up on the screen, and then you'll be able to swipe that back down to the bottom again. And so you've probably seen this sort of pattern used in other applications before. And I have done some stuff recently that is similar. I've done two tutorials recently. This Tinder cards one, which we might take a look at in a bit. Basically just again using the Ionic gestures to create this sort of Tinder card swipe gesture. And I also did a Gmail style swipe to archive as well. So I'll link to both of those in the description so you can check them out if you want a bit more sort of backstory on how the gestures and animations work. I'll kind of assume you have some level of knowledge of that. So if you don't, just basically come in here and read this brief introduction to Ionic gestures. But the general concept is we can import this gesture functionality here, and then we can create a gesture that looks something like this. We create some options specifying what happens when the gesture starts, when the input moves, and when it finishes. We can create that gesture, enable it, attach it to some element that's on the page, and then it's going to listen for that gesture and it's going to react in the way that we describe. And this example in particular is not using Angular. In Angular, we actually have a gesture controller that we can use. So I won't get too much into the theory here. Let's actually start building some stuff and we'll talk about things along the way. So I have a default application generated. This is just a blank Ionic application, and I've already set up a component called slide draw, which you can see here. It just has nothing in it, just the default template. Got that imported into the home module, and then I've just dumped that at the bottom of the home page. So what we might do first is just add a little bit of styling to this to make it look a bit more obvious. What I considered doing is whether we would have this depend on an Ionic component. For example, we could make this an Ion card and see what that looks like. So we could have this kind of styling and pull that up, or we could just do the styling ourselves. I reckon what we will do is stick with the Ion card just because it's going to give us some cool styling to begin with, and we're not going to have to worry so much about that. We can just focus on the functionality and actually have this look nice by default, so that's good. I might just fill this out properly with, say, Ion card header. We'll just add some test content in here. Ion card content. Get rid of that space as well. Okay, so we just have this sort of card at the bottom here. And so what I want to happen first of all is for this card to be off screen. So I want this to be quite a bit larger than it currently is. We'll just set a height on this. So let's go into the SCSS here, and we'll say Ion card. We'll make the content area, let's give that a minimum height of say 500 pixels. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, cool. So that's probably about the size that I think it should be. I'd also, I think, like this to be kind of more full width. Don't want to spend too much time messing around with the styling just yet, but I would like something nice to work with. So let's say if we said margin, let's get rid of all the margins completely. I think we'll go with that. So let's set Ion card. I think we might actually need to use the CSS variable for this, not sure. Set that to 0. Give that a refresh. Okay, so that works. So this is what it would look like in its kind of expanded position. So we have the card sitting kind of most of the way over the screen at the moment. So what I want it to do is initially I want this to be positioned down at the bottom of the screen, and then I want to be able to slide it up. So usually we've been relying on translate to get these sort of swipe gestures going. So we go from the original position and then we're using translate X or translate Y to make it follow the gesture, and then move that left or right or whatever needs to happen. So we could use translate Y with this, which in general is the better option. Where possible, you want to use transforms to do gestures and animations just because they are more performant. They're not affecting other things on the screen. So if I use translate, it's going to perform a lot better. Another option we have here is to use some sort of absolute positioning and then modify where this sits on the screen. So we do want this to kind of overlay the Ion content. We don't want it to occupy space on the screen. So whatever content is in Ion content, we want to sit behind this card. We don't want this card to just occupy all this space. And the problem is if we use translate, for example, so I'll say transform translate Y, say 200 pixels, 400 pixels, make it 500, so it's right on the bottom there. So this kind of gets the effect that we wanted. So this is at the bottom, and then we could translate the Y up into its normal position. But the problem is that if you look at Ion content here, it's not fulfilling all the space that the app slide draw would be taking up usually. So in the terms of like the positions of the elements on this page, it's almost as if the slide draw is already expanded and we only have this little amount of space to work with. So instead what we might do, and again, this is all, I'm doing this live and thinking about this live, so there may be better ways to approach this. I'm just sort of thinking through my thoughts right now and what seems best to me in the moment. So definitely don't take this as the best way to go about this, but it may end up being that way. So what I'm thinking is if we say position absolute, so what that is going to do is remove the this element, the app slide draw. It's going to remove it from the general flow of the elements on the page. And what that means basically is that it's not affecting everything else on the screen right now, and it's not affected by anything. So this Ion content now, even though we still have app slide draw there, the Ion content is able to take up the full space on the screen, and this app slide draw is above it. It's sitting in the top left corner. So what we then want to do is we'd say, well, we want that to be on the bottom. So we'll say bottom 0 pixels, and we'll set left and right to 0 as well. So now that's going to stretch that across the whole screen. So now if I highlight this Ion content, you can see that it's taking up the full space of the screen still, and then we have this element overlaid on top of that. Now, one thing I want to do now, which I'm not 100% sure on, is we could, for example, say we want this to be negative 400 pixels from the bottom, which is going to push it down off the screen, which is what we want. We just want that little sort of tag there to pull up on. But if we want this to be a variable height, we kind of want it to be positioned based on the top, not the bottom. So we want the top of this element to be just in view. So I could set that dynamically, I guess, with JavaScript. If we were to go instead from the top, and then we did basically the height of the window. So say the height of this is 812. We could say 812 pixels take 50, for example. We'll go to 750. And then that would give us a little tab there at the top to grab onto. I'm just not 100% sure if that's the best way to do it. I'm trying to think if there's a way in CSS that we can position absolutely based on the top of the element, not the bottom. I might just do a quick Google search around and see what I can come up with. Just scrolling through these results here, just having a bit of a research. I just noticed percentage values, which I forgot about. So we can actually just do like 90%, I think, which should work for what we want. The only problem with this, I think, might come when then we try to scroll this with the gesture. We want to basically increase that value. Or what if we leave that at 90% all the time and then also transform it? So translate y, say negative 300 pixels. So I think this general concept should work. Let me just scroll that value. Yeah. So I think this general concept should work. So we'll set the position to absolute 90% from the top, and then we'll move this up and down by modifying the translate y transform, which hopefully should keep this nice and performant, and it should work well. So let's give that a shot. Let me just close down these tabs I don't need anymore. Okay, so let's just say app slide draw. And we want to set all these values. I'll just copy these. And we don't actually want to set the transform, the translate, because we are going to do that in JavaScript with the gesture. So we will give that a refresh. Those values don't seem to be on there. This CSS won't work from here actually. Can I do the host? Let me check that. Yeah. So if we use the host pseudo selector, we can apply these style values to the host component. The problem there was I was targeting app slide draw, but app slide draw is actually in our home page file here. This app slide draw tag doesn't actually exist in the slide draw component template. So if we're putting it in the slide draw SCSS, it needs to target this host pseudo selector to apply it to that host element. I hope that makes sense. And it's better to do that here because that way, when we're using this component, we don't need to go and manually style it wherever we're using it. Okay, so let's give this a refresh and just make sure everything is working as we expect. So we have our little tab here. We could adjust that to different values if we want, depending on how much we want to show down the bottom here. And what I might also do is set this background color of the content area just to be a bit darker. I'm not sure how well this will show up on video. So what we're going to do is go into our home page CSS, and we're just going to set Ion content to have a background of, let's try just F2, F2, F2 to begin with. This is probably a little bit too dark. I just basically want us to be able to see this card because I'm not sure if on the video it's not going to be as obvious. But I do still want it to look nice. So we'll go with that gray value there. Okay, so now we can get to work on the gesture. So basically what I want to do is listen for a gesture on this for like a vertical drag, and then I just want to respond to that by moving its position up and down. So let's go into the slide draw component here, and what we're going to do is import a gesture controller from Ionic Angular. And I am using the release candidate for Ionic 5 here, which is important. You won't be able to use the gesture controller unless you're using Ionic 5. So we'll set up the gesture controller. And if you are using something like Stencil.js, for example, you don't need to set up the gesture controller in this way. You can just import the gestures directly like this. And in order to create the gesture, we're going to need a reference to the element itself. So what I'm going to do is include element ref from Angular core. We'll set that up in the constructor. And basically this is just going to allow us to get a reference to the native DOM element so we can set up the gesture on that. I think this will need to be an after view init as well in order to be able to get a reference to that element. We'll need the view to be initialized. So we'll change this to ng after view init. And this is where we are going to set up our gesture. So we'll say const gesture equals await. And since that's going to be await, we're going to have to make this asynchronous. So anytime we use await to await a promise finishing, we need to do that inside of an async method. So we'll await this.gestureController.create, and then we can create our gesture in here. So what I might do actually is also import gesture config, which will tell us what our options need to be. So I'm going to create a separate options object with a type of gesture config. And then we'll just pass that to the create method. And the benefit of using the type here now is that it's going to tell us if we're using the right methods or not. Though it is telling me that the gesture config doesn't exist. No, it's not gesture config. I think it's gesture options I want. It's something. Let me look that up. It's a little bit difficult now because the documentation for the Ionic Animations API isn't out just yet. We'll also import that. I should be able to import the gesture type, I think. Let's just go have a look. So we'll probably just bring up the node modules itself. We should be able to see directly in here in Ionic Angular. And this would be a provider, gesture controller. Okay, so the gesture and gesture config comes from Ionic core. So maybe I'll just import those as well, just so we have the types. So our const gesture will have a type of gesture, and our options will be a gesture config. And now we have that sort of type safety going on, so we can see what we're missing and what we need. And so you can see here, this is an invalid config object because it doesn't have an element property. So we'll do that. Create an element, and then we can reference the native DOM element through our element ref. So we'll say this.element.native element. And then we can fill in the rest of the properties, which will be just like this. And I'm going to just copy and paste these ones, just so I don't need to write it all out. We'll call the gesture slide draw swipe. And now we got to figure out what to do on start, on move, and on end. And the basic concept is going to be mostly the same as this Tinder card example that I did. So we're going to have a look at this, and the main difference is going to be that we're translating vertically instead of horizontally. So this is for Stencil.js, so we're just sort of directly manipulating stuff from the DOM. With Angular, we're going to use the renderer, which is a little bit more proper in an Angular sense. So we'll set up renderer there, get a reference to that. And that's basically going to allow us to modify some styles and change the things we need. And so we're basically just going to copy this. So on start, we want to set the transition to none. And I'm just trying to think of the reason for that. Yes, because when we are translating, when we move the element, when we're swiping it, we're just going to change it so that the delta x value, which is the value that shows how far from the origin of the gesture has moved. So if we move our mouse just a little bit, it's going to have a delta x of like 10 pixels, for example. And we just want this card to follow that value. So as we move the mouse up, we'll change the transform y value to match the delta y value, which is the amount it has changed in the y direction. Now I'll show you this in a little bit more detail in a second. And now the reason we set transition to none at the beginning is because later when we let go of this thing, if we want it to snap into place, we want to animate that smoothly with the transition. But when we are just changing the value a lot manually with that delta value, we don't want it to transition between values because it's going to mess things up. And hopefully that'll be a little bit clearer when we actually do this. But for now, let's just basically copy what's going on in this Tinder card. So we'll set the transition to none. So we'll say this .renderer .set style. We'll change the native element. The style we want to change is transition, and we want to set it to none. Now for the next bit, the on move, this is what happens as the gesture is moving. So as we're moving the mouse up and down or our finger up and down on the screen, so the gesture has begun, now some movement is happening and we want to react to it. And again, this is going to be pretty much the same as the Tinder example, except we're going to modify the translate y and the delta y, or to the delta y, rather than translate x and delta x. And we're not going to have the rotation either, which the Tinder cards have. So let's say for this one, this .renderer .set style, and we're going to change our host native element. We're going to modify the transform, and we're going to set that to translate y, and that's going to be event.delta y. So we're changing the transform to translate y, ev.delta y, which is the same as this one, except we're not rotating it. And this actually needs to have pixels in there as well. And so we should actually be able to see something happen now. So let's just save this and make sure that we have stuff happening. In order for this gesture to work, we do need to enable it. So we've created it by creating this options object, passing that to the gesture controller to create it. And then once the gesture has been created, we will call gesture.enable. And that's going to set that gesture up and start listening. So let's jump into the application, and hopefully we've got some stuff going on. Bring up the console. So if I grab this now, so I'm trying to pull it, and we get a sort of, I had something happen there, but why isn't that? That is interesting. I'm not sure what happened there. I'm expecting to be able to drag this whole thing, but it seemed there was only like a part of that actually did anything. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to log out this onMove event, and I'm going to see if we're getting anything for that. So I'll log out that event and give that a drag. We'll just refresh this as well. Okay, so I'm not actually getting the vertical pan. That's interesting. This was a thing that was in Hammer.js where by default you couldn't vertically pan, you had to enable that option. And so what is happening here is that I basically need to do a horizontal, I need to start the gesture horizontally and then I can pull it up and down. I'm not sure why that is happening. I assume there is some configuration option I need to supply to the gesture. let's go to that definition. So max angle. Oh, so we have a direction, which, okay. So there's a direction property, and I guess by default it's set to X, but we can manually set it to Y. And if you missed what I did there, by the way, you can, with these types, if I just click on a type, I can say go to definition, and I can see the full implementation of that type, which in this case obviously showed us about this direction value. And so we should be able to set that to Y, save that. And now hopefully, yes, we can pull this up and down, but it's not going to go, it's not going to recognize the left and right gestures anymore, which is good, we don't need them. So I can now pull that up and down. So we have the start of this gesture sort of completed, but there's a couple things we need to do to finish this up. And obviously we don't just want to be able to pull this anywhere on the screen and just leave it there. We want to have some rules as to what happens at certain positions, and we want it to snap to the correct area. And again, this is going to be very similar to what we did with the Tinder card here. So again, I'm going to copy this general logic here. We're going to have to change it up for Angular because we're using Angular stuff instead of just stencil stuff. But I do basically want to follow this same sort of logic. So what I'm going to do is say this.renderer.setStyle. Again, it's going to be that native element. I'm going to set transition to, we use the same transition as well. We don't need to, but I'll say 0.3 seconds ease out. So that's that part of it done. And now basically what we want to do is, if the card is dragged far enough up, we want to snap it into its like top position. But if we don't drag it far enough, we want it to snap back into the bottom position. And again, as I mentioned, this is basically the same concept as the Tinder cards, where if you swipe it far enough, you want it to go off the screen. If you don't swipe it far enough, you want it to go back to its original position. So basically what I'm going to try here is to say if event.delta_y is greater than, and we're going to use the window height here. Oh, actually we don't really need to use the height, I don't think. What I'm going to do is use a static value. So if it's moved, say, 100 pixels, we want to snap to top. Actually, in this case, we don't need anything in the other direction. We only want it to move up. So we should probably add some extra code here, actually, that checks if the event.delta_y is positive, because we only want to move it in the up direction. So we only want to do that if it's above 0. Let me just check that my logic pans out on that. I'll just quickly comment out this stuff so we can give this a quick test. So let's check the delta_y there. Okay, so it's up the negative direction. Okay, so negative values are up, positive values are down. So we actually want this to be less than 0. Let's check if that works. So now if I try to drag it down, it doesn't work. If I try to drag it up, it does work. Cool. And we probably should also put some kind of ceiling on it as well. I'm not going to worry about that just yet. If we have time in the video, I'll do it. But basically, we might also want to stop people from dragging this too far up. But I'm not going to do that right now. Let's focus on our end logic. So if the event.delta_y is greater than 100, we want to snap to the top position. Otherwise, we want to send it back to its original position. And so to do this, we'll say this.renderer.setStyle, this.element.nativeElement. I'm going to change the transform. And again, let's just steal that so I don't have to retype it out. And its top position, I guess we'd also need to perhaps dynamically figure out if we wanted this to be adaptable. let's just set this to, let's say, really we want it to be the height of the native element, I guess. Actually, for now, I think I'll have to think about this a bit more, how exactly I want to approach this, but as usual, the video is getting long, so I might just set this to a default value. I think that should have to be negative 500 pixels. And then, yeah, if we have time, I'll figure this out a little bit better. So that's snapping to the top position. And then otherwise, we want to snap it to the bottom position, which would be a translate y of 0. So we'll say this.renderer.set style, this.element.native element transform. It's going to be none. We should be able to just set that to a blank value actually instead of setting it to 0. Actually, let's set it to a value. So I'm not sure if that actually affects the transition animation. So we'll set that to 0 pixels. And we'll get rid of all of this Tinder code now. And let's just see what's going on, because there's a good chance that something here is broken. So give it a refresh, and let's pull that up. If I let go, surprisingly, it snaps nicely back down. If I pull this up far enough, or we're just always going to snap back down. Okay, so that is a good start. So basically this condition is never being satisfied. So if delta y is greater than 100, and I think that's because we're working with negative values, which I forgot about already. So we'll say negative 100. Let's even say negative 200, because I think that's going to be too small otherwise. So now if I drag it up a little bit, it pops up to the top. Well, now it's always doing that. Let's see, what's the y value here? Delta y, negative 34. Oh, I forgot to flip my comparison. So it's less than negative 200. Let's try that again. So pull it up a little bit, snaps down, pull it up a lot, and it snaps to the top, which is good. And I think we're going a little bit too far, because the height of the whole thing is 500 pixels. So we're gonna have to go a little bit less than that if we don't want it to be fully on the screen, because it's going to look a bit better if there's still a little bit hanging off the bottom. So now we have that working. We just now need to do the reverse. I'm trying to decide whether we want to do that in this video, so I can pull it up. And that's kind of actually working, the gesture back down, but it's just luck really that it's working that way. Because we should also be able to drag this down to set it back to this bottom point. But as you can see, when it's in this expanded position, if I try to drag it down, it's not working because we've set it to only listen for dragging up. And we did that here initially. Because we didn't want in this position, let me just refresh this. In this position, we don't want it to be able to be dragged down. We want it to be only dragged up. But then when it's expanded, we want it to be the opposite. We want it to be able to be dragged down, but not up. Now this isn't going to be a particularly difficult thing to do, but this video is too long now. So I'm not going to do that in this video, but perhaps if you've been following along with this, it might be a good chance to see if you can figure out how to do it. So basically you're just gonna, there's different ways you could do it, but there's gonna be kind of two states, a kind of expanded, non-expanded state. And you're just gonna basically wanna flip the logic here so that when it's in that expanded state, you're going to only allow movement if the delta y is greater than 0, and you're just gonna be translating in the other direction. So it might be like a good little sort of homework task to do, but mostly it'll be the same sort of logic that we've already been using. But you can see here, it works how we want. We can drag that nicely, and if we let go at a certain point, it's going to snap either to the expanded position or it's going to go back to its initial resting position. And so you can either do that really slow if you want, you can just slowly drag that up. But it's also going to work if you do a sort of just a quick little swipe up gesture, and that's going to look pretty nice. So there are still a couple of improvements here to make. As I mentioned, obviously we need to get the reverse gesture going so you can push that back down when it is expanded. I am just using a set height currently for setting this expanded position to 450 pixels. We could make that dynamic as well. And also probably we'd want to use, say, ng content, so we can actually supply some content through the component to the drawer here. You also might not want to use the ion cards. You might just want to use your own divs with some styling. So there's plenty more improvements that can be made here and more to do, but I think the general idea has been accomplished here. We've got this gesture working that we can expand and shrink this drawer. And that's mostly what I wanted to focus on in this video. So please do feel free to have an attempt at finishing this off. If you do that, it'd be great to leave a link in the comments so other people can check it out, see what you did. Otherwise, yeah, if you enjoyed this video, do feel free to leave a like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.